So good afternoon. So great to have people here with us today with three rabbis who are going to talk about why we decided to leave careers in midstream and shift over to the rabbinate. Our moderator this afternoon is Doug Moss, and he is a congregant and a superintendent of the Mountain View School District, and a very knowledgeable and interesting and creative and smart person. So here is Doug Moss.
Thank you, Rabbi. So today we have three esteemed rabbis with us, and we're going to have a discussion. I have some questions. Some people have already sent in some questions, which is fantastic. However, if you have additional questions, you can put them into the chat, and I'll be moderating the chat as we go through as well. As far as introductions, I'll start off with Rabbi Michael Locker, is a second career rabbi, having been ordained at age 55 from Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in 2003. He's a physicist who spent his first career in alternative energy, focusing on wind, solar, and geothermal energy. He holds undergraduate and graduate degrees in physics from Queens College in New York City and from the University of Illinois. Prior to his ordination from HUC-JIR, the Reform Movement's Rabbinic Seminary in 2003, he received his Master of Hebrew Letters degree from the same institution. An entrepreneur, he started a number of alternative energy firms, including a wind power development company that installed and operated wind farms in Hawaii and California. He's widely published in the alternative energy field. He is presently Rabbi Emeritus at Temple Narami in Camarillo, California, and Scholar in Residence at Temple Adat Elohim in Thousand Oaks, and a community rabbi for the Jewish Federation of Ventura County. He is a member of the Central Conference of American Rabbis and the Board of Rabbis of Southern California. His interest and participation in interfaith dialogue stimulated his rabbinic thesis entitled Ezer Kenegdo, Toward a Theology of Jewish-Christian Partnership. He's a sought-after speaker at synagogues, churches, and campuses. In June 2014, he offered the opening prayer at the United States House of Representatives. Welcome, Rabbi Locker.
Thank you.
Rabbi Annette Koch most recently served as Rabbi of Temple Israel of Alameda, California. Previously, she served as Assistant Rabbi at Congregation Makor Shalom in Cherry Hill, at Congregation Agadas Shalom in Lynchburg, Virginia, as a member of the rabbinic team at Sherami in Newtown, Pennsylvania, as rabbi and director of lifelong learning at Temple Shalom of Lower Bucks County, and as rabbi and director of education at Bet Havarim SMJC in Oregon. In addition, she served as a chaplain at St. Mary's Rehabilitation Hospital in Longhorn, Pennsylvania, the recipient of Master of Arts degree in Hebrew Letters from Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in New York. Rabbi Koch was ordained by HUC-JIR in 2006, and native of New York City. She received her BA degree from the City College, the City University of New York, and graduated magna cum laude from New York Law School. Before entering rabbinic school, she practiced law in New York. Welcome, Rabbi Koch. Rabbi Singer joined Temple Beth El as rabbi and educator in February 2008. As a daughter of a Holocaust survivor, she's keenly aware of the need to make our world a better place. She currently serves as a member of the Reform Movement's Commission on Social Action, as president of the Pacific Area Reform Rabbis, and previously as a member of the City of Riverside's Task Force on Police Reform, and as a commissioner for the City of Riverside's Human Relations Commission. She has led advocacy efforts through local interfaith organizations, succeeded in helping pass alternative to jail and aid in dying legislation, developed significant relationships with local, state, and national legislators, and secured funding for and organized trips to Sacramento and Washington, D.C. for confirming students to learn about the legislative process and to engage in lobbying for the Reform Movement's Latakin seminars. Before coming to Riverside, Rabbi Singer served at Temple Sinai in Oakland, California. She also served as both director of the Introduction to Judaism program for the Pacific Southwest Council of the Union for Reform Judaism, and as coordinator of the Leadership Initiative at Hebrew Union College, Los Angeles campus. She grew up in New York City and attended the Lycée Français du New York from elementary through high school. She holds 3 master's degrees, a Master of Arts in Hebrew Letters, and a Master of Arts in Judaic Studies from Hebrew Union College, and a Master's in Journalism from the University of California, Berkeley, where she also earned a bachelor's degree in comparative literature. Rabbi Singer was ordained by HUC in 2003. Welcome, Rabbi Singer. All right, it is fantastic to have the three of you here. I know we have a lot of questions. We have questions coming in the chat as well. And starting off with looking back in time, you all started off in different fields. You clearly had different interests. So when you were looking at initially going into college, initially looking at studies, besides what you ultimately wound up studying, your first degrees, was there an interest? Was there a seed planted in potential rabbinic studies in the future? And we'll start with Rabbi Locker.
Thank you. Yeah, I often say that although I was born Jewish, I was never a Jewish youth. Yes, I was Jewish and I was a youth, but I had almost no interest. My parents were very Yiddishkeit, but we did absolutely nothing except we had a Passover Seder every year. And I think out of a source of intergenerational guilt, my parents made sure that I went to Hebrew school and became bar mitzvah. But once I was bar mitzvah, I didn't enter a synagogue again for about 20 years or more. I never went to a high holiday service until my mid-30s. So I was always kind of the science nerd. And really had very little interest in Judaism or spirituality. And, you know, I suspect we'll get into this, but as my colleagues know, and as some of my friends in Riverside know, my late wife died of a disease called Huntington's disease, which is a genetic disease. And I knew that her father had it. And I knew she would have a 50% chance of having it. And that got me interested in, or I would say, needing a source of spiritual strength. And I sometimes describe it as a desire to make deposits into a spiritual strength bank, because I knew I would be making serious withdrawals later in life.
Thank you, Rabbi. And Rabbi Koch, would you like to respond?
Sure. I'll give you the short version, which is that I have much in common with both Rabbi Locker and Rabbi Singer. I am also the child of a Holocaust survivor family. Both of my parents were survivors. And Yiddishkeit was in the air we breathed. So I'm a native Yiddish speaker. I went to Aberdeen Yiddish school. I can speak, read, and write Yiddish. I'd be happy to talk to you guys about that sometime. But my parents were totally different in their approach to Yiddishkeit. So my father was what we call lovingly an apikoiris, a complete apostate. He was a Jewish socialist. The Abedring is a Jewish socialist organization. I went to after-school programs, sleepaway camps, all kinds of things there. My mother was a spiritual human being and grew up, well, both of them grew up in Eastern Europe. There was only one way to be Jewish, and that was Orthodox, unless you weren't, unless you were like my dad and went to socialism. So in our home, there were Shabbat candles every Friday night, and there was, every holiday. And that was the deal they made to keep peace, is that, but also when I was really little, they sent me to a YM and YWHA summer camp because that was all we could afford. It was an Orthodox-ish community. It was the first place I ever saw a Torah scroll. And I think there was something about that planted a seed and just grew throughout my life. There were lots of moments in my life when people suffered tragedy, when I suffered tragedy. There was no moment of conversion. And until I imagine you could say, I looked at my child who was 4 at the time and really had no idea he was Jewish. And I said, there's really something wrong with this picture. and found a congregation that some of my friends belonged to. And we started going, and both of us got hooked. So that's all she wrote. That was the beginning of the journey, and I'm sure we'll talk about that a little more later.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Rabbi Singer.
So my mother was a survivor of Auschwitz. So that's always been very, very important to me. However, growing up, more like Rabbi Locker's background, very, very little Jewish anything, Yiddishkeit. We ate ham and clams and lobster, and we celebrated Christmas. We used to have a Christmas tree, and the big night for, the family was to go to my grandmother's on Christmas Eve and, have a big dinner and presents. And then the next morning to wake up and open presents at home. I never even knew that was weird until many, many, many years later. I actually really wanted to go to religious school, and my family belonged to Temple Emmanuel in New York, which is sort of the bastion of classical reform. So very, very assimilated. I don't think I ever saw a Torah scroll. And the only reason I learned any Hebrew was that I was in the choir. That's hilarious since I can't sing, but in any event, I learned a few lines in Hebrew. So it was just very, very bereft of anything really Jewish. And my grandparents on my father's side were very much into assimilation. We had this other name before that supposedly was changed at Ellis Island, although that's apparently a complete myth. We weren't even allowed to say the name. It was like saying Voldemort or something, it was like this, really scary. Even today, if I said it, I get scared, and so there's just really was, so my sisters went off in the direction of really having absolutely no interest in Judaism, being virtually hostile to religion, not even virtually. I always had some sense of what later on I came to understand as Emil Fackenheim's 614th commandment, which is not to give Hitler a posthumous victory by abandoning Judaism. So that was always there as a little spark waiting to be lit. And it wasn't until I was in my early 30s that I lived in DC, Washington, DC, and a friend of mine decided to have a bat mitzvah when she turned 40. And she belonged to Farbrengen, which was sort of a havurah of, lady, except, there's no rabbi that led it, but there were rabbis who were members of it. And I started going with her, and we would have these really long conversations about the Torah portion of the week from all these really fascinating perspectives. And I took a class with her on Midrash, and I was part of her service. And that's really kind of what sparked it for me. And then I started taking some classes, and I really did have a moment of spiritual awakening. I know that was a question that Harvey has. And I haven't told many people about this because it seems so weird, but I had never read the Bible, and I had this Bible from confirmation, white leather. I'm sure you guys probably got this. I never had a bat mitzvah because they didn't believe in even bar mitzvahs at Temple Emmanuel. So I was confirmed with a white leather Bible with gold, leaf around the edges, totally in English, no Hebrew. So I thought, I should read this. So I was in DC. I was about to move to LA, and I'm reading it, and I think, not much has changed since those days. We're still the same old people we were then, sibling rivalry, wars, the whole bit. And then I suddenly looked up and I said, I'm going to be a rabbi. And it was like, what the heck is this? This is, Christians would call it a call, but we don't call it that. I thought, okay, that was weird. Let's move on. And a couple of days later, I had lunch with a friend of mine who's a TV producer, which was what I was at the time. And I said to her, I'm thinking about doing something very different with my life. And she looked me straight in the eyes and said, you're going to be a rabbi. And then it took me 10 years, but we'll talk about that later.
Thank you.
I do want to interject that when I am involved in a lot of interfaith work, and my Christian clergy friends do, as Rabbi Singer mentioned, always talk about a calling. When was your calling? And I don't know any rabbis that speak in that language. There was a discussion on the CCAR Facebook page, and I was surprised, if I remember correctly, how many rabbis actually did speak about that, but none that I've ever heard live or in person talk about an actual calling, like, it came to me.
You know, it's really interesting because one of the rabbis at HUC in Jerusalem used to talk about that the rabbinate is a calling, and that we've all had a moment of calling. But for me, it wasn't God, it was another rabbi. It was a student rabbi at our congregation where I had become very active in leadership, and I was the vice president for ritual. And she was a student rabbi at HUC, and she was coming to Reform Temple of Suffern. And so I used to have her over for Shabbat dinner on the night she would come to help lead services. And one day she called me into the kitchen, and I thought, oh my God, I'm in trouble. You know, she kept saying, I need to talk to you. Can you come into the kitchen, please? And I thought, oh God, what have I done? What have I said? And she is now Rabbi Rebecca Rosenkrantz. And she said, have you ever thought about becoming a rabbi? And I looked at her and said, no, absolutely not. Don't even be ridiculous. Yeah, that was all she wrote or said. So I guess it was a moment of calling, but not quite the same.
Well, you know, I always said, and I would tell other people, that I believe we know deep inside what we're meant to do in the world. My problem was that I couldn't figure that out for the first 40 years of my life. Seriously, that's why I went into TV. I mean, I majored in comparative literature. And what was I going to do with that? Get a PhD and write really obscure things that nobody could understand? I thought, no, that's not going to work. So I wanted to do something that had more relevance to society. So I decided to go to journalism school. And I ended up in TV for 20 years. And unlike my colleagues here who may have enjoyed their earlier careers, I was miserable for almost the entire time. And I couldn't figure out what I wanted to do until I finally decided to listen to myself.
I guess that's another question that we had, and that's and thank you for bringing that up, Rabbi Singer, is, you know, there's some people enjoy what they did before. Some people very much enjoyed what they did before, and then felt this desire to make a change or to go in a different direction. And it happens at different times in our lives and for different reasons. So did you enjoy what you did before? Did it bring you, you know, a certain level of satisfaction in the work that you were doing and your contributions? And at what point did that change, or was this just another path? Meaning you still enjoyed what you were doing, but that rabbinic studies and moving in that direction was just another path. And I'll start with you, Rabbi Koch.
So I loved being an attorney. I went, but like Rabbi Singer, I did major in comparative literature, and I actually went to graduate school for comparative literature, but it felt like it wasn't going to be very useful. And I felt like I was wasting time. So I switched to law school, which I'd always sort of been interested in, and went to law school, especially because I was a dual major, philosophy and comparative literature. And my philosophy professor once said, philosophy bakes no bread, you know. So I went to law school. I loved law school, and I liked the work I did. I was at a firm called Wild Gottschall and Manges, which was pretty big, and had a lot of fun. It was fun. I was by then also a single parent, and I needed something that wasn't going to be as much fun, wasn't going to be as much traveling, wasn't going to be as many hours. So I went to Citigroup, where I became a vice president, deputy general counsel of one of their standalone subsidiaries, and had a more rational life and did work that was really interesting, really interesting. The problem was, as I said, I decided to put my son in religious school, and I couldn't be a hypocrite. So in spite of the fact that I was very personally and strongly, profoundly identified as Jewish, coming from this Holocaust survivor Yiddishist background, I knew nothing about the Jewish religion. So I started taking him to services. And I started attending adult education because he came home with questions I couldn't answer. And then we got a new rabbi. She was a recent graduate of Hebrew Union College. Her name is Rabbi Elise Frischman. If you guys use Mishkan Tefillah, you see her name in the front of your book every time you worship. But she was a brand new rabbi, and her enthusiasm and her intelligence was really contagious. And the more I learned, the more I wanted to learn. And then I got involved in synagogue leadership, board member. Eventually, this know-nothing Jew became chair of the ritual committee, which was really bizarre. And I exhausted every opportunity for lay study that was available to me and felt like I needed more. At the same time, one of the best parts of being a lawyer was the fact that people would come into your office to ask for, with their issues, with their concerns, with their problems, whether they were business related or personal, because they knew that they could trust you unconditionally to maintain their confidence. And that became the best part of my legal work, was the relationships with other people and making them feel seen and making them feel heard and making them feel understood. And I started putting the pieces together, and eventually, when Rabbi Rebecca said to me, "Have you ever thought about becoming a rabbi?" And I was saying, no, absolutely not. I had too much going on in my life, too many people I was supporting, too many things I was doing. But yeah, she may not have actually planted the seed. She may have woken it up.
Thank you, Rabbi. And Rabbi Locker.
Yeah, so I was actually in a PhD program in physics, and I just assumed if I took the highest degree in the hardest subject I could think of course people would beat a path to my door. And I was in graduate school at the University of Illinois, which was a top-notch physics school, really beyond my capabilities. I went to a liberal arts undergrad school where I learned useless things like public speaking and writing and things that I've never thought I would ever have any use for. But I really was not well prepared for graduate level physics. And I was talking with people who were graduating with PhDs, and they were getting jobs selling shoes because this was in the early 70s, a recession. There were just no jobs for physicists. So I left after getting a master's, and I just lucked into the very early stages of the alternative energy world. I was very quickly after I got my first job working for a utility, was the first Arab oil embargo, and there was a lot of interest. And then I just flicked from job to job, I would say every 2, 3, 4 years, occasionally changing careers, but mostly in alternative energy. And I never had a career path. I would just do some stuff. I was having fun doing it, and something else fun would come along and I would change it. I remember once I was interviewed by a headhunter that I was probably in my 30s. And she said, "Well, where do you see your career going?" And I was embarrassed to realize that I had no idea. It's just as long as I was earning a decent living and enjoying what I was doing, I'm fine. And then as my late wife got ill, and I realized I was headed toward a nightmare. And I remember thinking, I have kids that are about to go to college. I have I started getting more deeply interested in Judaism, very much like Rabbi Koch. I just started taking adult education courses. Unlike Rabbi Singer, I didn't even own a Bible. I had to go out and buy a Bible. And then the more I learned, the more I got interested. When I studied physics, the deeper I studied physics at the graduate level, the less interesting it was. It was applied exotic mathematics. And I've discovered over the years, the deeper I get into Jewish studies, the more I love it. So I just got more and more interested. And then, I started taking lots of classes. Then occasionally I would teach some classes. And then I would say, as a midlife spiritual crisis, I realized that no matter how much money I made, there were always an infinite number of people making more than me. And that I would go to these kalot, I think, Annette, we met at a
We
Kala,
met at a Kala.
right?
Yeah,
And they were in,
I'm saving
Santa-
that story.
we were in, it was in Santa Cruz, and it was amazing. And there were just some amazing rabbis teaching there. Mordechai Findlay, Larry Kushner. The music was Debbie Friedman and Jeff Klepper. I mean, just, it was heaven. And I, and I shared some of my life situation with rabbis, and I came to appreciate that I only felt human when I could take the pain in my life and help other people deal with the pain in their life. And then, it was absolutely clear to me that it was impossible for me to become a rabbi. I had a home, a mortgage. I had a wife who was going to go into a nursing home. I had kids that were getting ready to go away to college. It was impossible. And then, in a moment of intense prayer, and I guess maybe you could call it a calling. Interesting, I don't think of it as a calling. There's a wonderful line, it appears actually a couple of times in the Bible, where it says God opened her eyes or his eyes. Happens to Hagar, happens actually in the Garden of Eden. And in one moment of introspection, it went from being impossible to easy, because it's just a different way of looking at things. Yeah, I had an expensive house and a mortgage, but with my wife going into a nursing home, with my kids leaving home, I didn't need that home. So now I had equity. And my father had passed away, and I had some money from my father and a bunch of other things, and it just became easy. And now I didn't know what path I was going to pursue. I thought about Jewish renewal for a while. And then actually, at the advice of a Jewish renewal rabbi, I decided to go to HUC, and also with the guidance of the woman who would become my wife, Sonia, who Rabbi Singer knows very well, having officiated at our wedding. She gave me some very valuable career guidance, as she continues to do so. But I mean, there were jobs I had that I didn't do well at. I've been hired and fired. I've started companies. I've been fired from companies. I've sold companies. So there were individual jobs I weren't that crazy about, but I was always, I think of myself kind of like as having the mental sophistication and emotional stability of a puppy dog. Whatever's going on, I'm really having fun doing it. And if I had a tail, you would see it wagging right now.
Doug, if you wouldn't mind, Jane asked a question that I think is relevant to this path. She asked, you have to believe in God to become a rabbi. And that actually was one of my obstacles. So I also took a lot of adult ed classes, over the years, and was more and more drawn. And I finally, when I turned whatever it was, 40, and I said, I can't do this anymore, when I was, so miserable in television. And I had the job that I thought was my ideal job. I was executive producer of POV, which is a documentary series on PBS. And I won 2 Emmys, which I found out about in the newspaper. Okay, anyway, that tells you a little bit about the people in the business. Anyway, so I just said, I can't do this anymore. That's it, I'm done. And luckily, I had a friend we had worked together at PBS, and she started sending me questions via the internet, and I would answer. And then she'd send me more questions. And eventually I laid out on on paper what I had written. It was like, this is screaming out at you. You do know what you want to do. So I went and I got a master's in Judaic Studies from Hebrew Union College. And I took all the same classes as the rabbinic students, but it's not the rabbinic path at that point. My big problem was God, because my mother was in Auschwitz and lost her whole family. And how could I believe in a traditional God that was in charge of the world? And, I'm sure the 2 other rabbis here have the same issues because of what happened in their lives. And so it wasn't until I finally took a class with Rabbi David Ellenson on modern Jewish thought that I realized, oh, wait a minute, there are a lot of different ways of understanding God in Judaism. It's, yes, the traditional rabbinic and biblical view is that there's some being that is in charge of the world, and that you do things and you get punished or you get rewarded. But that's not everybody's view of God, even, conservative and Orthodox rabbis. And once I understood that, it was very liberating. Oh, wait a minute, you can believe in God, but it doesn't have to be that particular God. And frankly, my theology is much more reconstructionist. I believe that God is the force of good in the world that allows us to make ourselves better people and allows ourselves to make the world better. And when I wrote my theology paper, it was called Fragmented Theology, because I pull from a lot of different places and it's not all consistent, but that's okay. Judaism, why does anything have to be consistent? So I think that's really important for congregants also to know that, it's not like, oh, I'm bad because I don't believe in God, or, I can't be Jewish because I don't believe in God. It's, what's the God you don't believe in? Because I probably don't believe in that God either. And that's what finally allowed me to actually apply to the rabbinic program. It was like, oh, I could say God and mean something, and not feel like a hypocrite.
And Rabbi Locker, would you like to address that as well, related to your experience when it comes to a belief in God and being a rabbi?
Yeah, I mean, I would very much echo Rabbi Singer that as I learned more about Judaism, I realized Judaism is more about what you do rather than what you believe. And I don't know if you could, well, it'd be an interesting question for the seminary. I don't ever remember being asked at the seminary whether you believe in God or writing a paper about what's your concept of God. But I would imagine if you were a very public atheist, you would have problems at HUC. But I have to imagine that because it never came up in conversation. It does come up, I don't want the discussion could easily come off the tracks. It does come up on issues of conversion. Do you have to believe in God to convert to Judaism? That's a separate question, and an interesting question. But certainly my concept of God has changed over time, and sometimes it's very, very simplistic and naive, and sometimes I align very much with Harold Kushner's concept of God. I also align very much with Reconstructionist Judaism, but I love the take of a personal God. While intellectually I have all kinds of issues with it, I have no doubt that the concept of a personal God and a God that I have a personal relationship with has affected my life. I'm choosing my words very carefully. I'm not so sure I believe in that, but I have no doubt that I have a personal relationship with God. I'm not so sure I believe in a God that has personal relationships, but there's always medication if I continue having these problems. But so there I am, and I think hypocrisy, and inconsistency has an undeserved bad name. I'm willing to live, in that world.
Rabbi Locker, it was Ralph Waldo Emerson who once said that consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds.
Exactly. Yes.
So I just want to add one thing and then let Rabbi Koch talk, because my fragmented theology, which I had to write a theology paper for Rabbi Ellenson. The reason I call it fragmented theology is that, yes, I believe in the Reconstructionist idea of God, but I also believe that I'm commanded by God, but I don't believe in a commanding God. So similar to your not believing in a personal God and yet feeling that you have a personal relationship, I feel commanded in terms of, ethical behavior. Even though I don't believe in that kind of God. So yeah, inconsistency is fine in Judaism. Just look at the Talmud. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I absolutely second and third, whatever, everything that the other rabbis have said. But my experience was just a little bit different in that the first person to ever talk to me about God was my mother, who pretty much, she lost. She and my father were both survivors. And as I said, came out very differently. My father came out, called himself an atheist. What he was a man who was furious with God for what he had suffered and what he had lost and what everyone he loved and knew suffered. And for a God who could allow the agonies that he had witnessed. My mother's idea of God was completely different. She was a lot like us. She had a personal relationship with a God who doesn't have personal relationships. And her way of describing God was that God was in her words, and I've clearly done a lot of thinking and come to different places with it, but she said, God's a power. God is the force in the universe. Rabbi Larry Kushner talks about God as being the ego of the universe, the self of the universe. So it is very reconstructionist in that way. But again, I have no problem saying that God commands us, that being in relationship with God, but in a kind of Buberian way, creates obligations in both directions. Fractured, splintered, inconsistent, who cares, right? From Spinoza to, I don't know, whatever. Judaism embraces all of the different ways of understanding God, and doesn't necessarily, although they did with Spinoza, throw us out for being naturalists and atheists either. There are a lot of atheist Jews in the world, and we love them too. They can't be members of the Union for Reform Judaism. I was at the URJ convention, it was UAHC then, when an ethical humanist congregation applied for membership, and their rabbi was actually an HUC grad. But they made it very clear they don't talk about God ever. They use a prayer book that never mentions God. There is nothing about God in any of their liturgy and any of their conversations with each other. God is not a presence in their community. And the URJ UAHC made a decision that to be a member of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations back then, God had to be some kind of presence, right? I don't remember being asked about God in my interview at HUC either, but I don't remember a whole lot about the interview. I was so excited and a little overwhelmed, which is odd because, after almost 20 years of practicing law, and having been in all kinds of intimidating places, you would think it wouldn't happen much, but it did. And but I don't remember that. And studying Jewish theology, which I was lucky, Kala. Michael said the first time we met was at a URJ Kala. The URJ and HUC had these joint programs where for 5 days during the summer, they would bring adults together with all kinds of amazing teachers to study seriously while having tremendous fun, singing, dancing, eating together. It was fun. And that was really where I got a deeper look at the breadth and scope of the variety of ideas of Judaism on everything. So I read Borowitz's Modern Choices in Jewish Thought during that period, long before I went to rabbinical school. And it made perfect sense to me that Reform Judaism, and this was one of the questions, why Reform Judaism? And one of the things about Reform Judaism is that Reform Judaism was the first way that we as modern Jews embrace the idea that at the essence of Judaism, the heart of Judaism is change. And it is adapting to what goes on in the world and bringing Jewish light to it, and Jewish lens to it, and Jewish vision to it. But that we embrace change. We embrace the world as it changes. That's the story of the Talmud, and we are inheritors of that tradition. And so when you look at the evolution of Jewish thought and Jewish philosophy, you see that. It's laid out in front of you. So Michael and I met at the Kala in Santa Cruz. That was the first time I'd gone to the one in Santa Cruz. I'd always gone to Brandeis, and you get to play with Debbie Friedman and, Eugene Borowitz and, Larry Hoffman and all kinds of interesting people. And that's where I was told to seriously reconsider any idea I had about becoming a rabbi. I was warned, and rightly so, that second career rabbis, especially women, had the hardest time. And that was Rabbi Larry Raphael, alav hashalom, who warned me. He said, it will not be an easy road to hoe. But I am a pathological optimist and thought, surely it would be fine. And it's been interesting.
And Rabbi Koch, can you expand upon that a little bit? What are the challenges? What were you presented with as the challenges of a second career female rabbi? What are some of the unique aspects? And not just, I mean, certainly from a female aspect, but also I'll ask Rabbi Locker the same thing as far as, what were some of the challenges that were presented to all of you, or the three of you, related to second career, and as you had specifically stated, as a second career woman coming into being a rabbi?
Truth is that sexism is alive and well. Sexism is alive and well, and there is a whole organization called Women's Rabbinic Network. And one of the jobs of our organization that I am a very proud member of is to deal with sexism. And if the things we've learned in the last year or so about sexual abuse, sexual harassment, sexual discrimination, it's real. And it's as real in congregational life as it is in organizational life. I know way too many women rabbis of any age who have been told, or to whom remarks have been made about, well, you're going to want to have children. Women don't work as hard because they prioritize their families, blah, 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 this and that. It's really very alive and well and kicking, sexism. Ageism in and of itself, whether you are male or female, is alive and kicking. They used to say Sammy Davis Jr. had it hard. He was both Black and Jewish, right? Older women, rabbis, have it tough. They're older and they're women. And if you're second career, it adds another layer of challenge, because you walk into a room and because of your age, people to expect you to have a level of knowledge and experience that you don't have, that you're not qualified for. But there's not a senior rabbi. There are very few senior rabbis on the planet who want to hire a rabbi as an assistant who reminds him of his mother.
Oh, wow.
There's also the fact that I found this even just with my internship that I had when I was still in school. I had a career for 20 years. I was successful. I was a professional. I was not a young 24-year-old, coming out of college or whatever. And so that was threatening to the person that I was working with. Like, you're not, because, this was, sorry to say, in Thousand Oaks. So, I had to schlep up to Thousand Oaks 3 times a week. And they wanted me to come even more often. I said, I'm not coming more than 3 times a week. It's a long drive. That's crazy, And that was like, she actually has a mind of her own. I think students these days have more of a mind of their own as well. But the other thing that I always found astonishing is, wouldn't you want to have a rabbi who has some life experience and some wisdom to share, not just a young person who plays the guitar and who supposedly wants to, is able to bring in young families? So I have 2 words to say to search committees that think that young rabbis are going to bring in young people. Bernie Sanders, okay? He was an old crotchety New York Jew. And guess what? Young people loved him.
They do
so
love
why,
him.
And I just want to add one other thing and then let Rabbi Locker speak, because there was a question about why reform. And I have one word to say about that, why I didn't go to the Reconstructionist Seminary, Philadelphia. I didn't want to move to Philadelphia. Really, because my theology is much closer to that. But, other than that, I mean, the Reform movement is the one I grew up in and the one I know, and I'm not terribly observant, so conservative would not work for me at all.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
But before I jump into the substance, I want to comment about, forgive me, rabbis, I'm going to refer to you by your first name.
Go ahead.
Okay.
I give you permission.
The three of us are friends.
Yes.
Yeah, Michael and I went to school together. So.
Yes, we were classmates and study buddies. So Annette, when you described your father and his anger at the God he professed not to believe in, I've had so many conversations with people in that place, and it always strikes me, and sometimes I verbalize it, is that how can you be angry at something you don't believe in? I mean, if you're angry at God, you believe in God. Now you may be angry at the God you believe in, but it's for me that's a particularly fascinating element of theology. My own experience, and maybe it's due to sexual discrimination, because I was on the plus side of that. I think being I was ordained at 55. I actually served I actually went to the congregation that I served before going to HUC. They lost a rabbi. It was a congregation in Camarillo. They lost a they never had a rabbi. They had rabbinic students from HUC. They did not join the union, so they got cut off from their rabbinic students, and they were looking for a lay leader, and I got the job. So I had what amounts to a monthly pulpit for 2 years before I started at HUC. And then when I graduated, I went back to my old job. In fact, they couldn't figure out why I had to go to rabbinical school. They kind of liked me before then, which actually is another problem in the rabbinate, because sometimes people become ordained by having cards printed. I call it, ordination by Vistaprint. But I actually had all the things that, Suzanne was talking about. I actually think for me, it was much easier as as somebody ordained at 55. Now, I did not need a very high-paying job. I never really had a full-time job. So I was not earning a huge, salary, but my old career, I had some financial resources. So that helped a lot. But to be a young rabbi and then also go to committee meetings and to go to, Saturday and Sunday, you're completely tied up. It's very, very difficult for young rabbis. I always thought I had a tremendous advantage on not having, those issues of trading off time between my kids and my career. I do think I had the benefit of people, expecting the rabbi to have life experience, and I had life experience. I think one of the two powerful things about my own life experience, which didn't have to do with formal training, was I had been through tragedy and I was a scientist. And I think that intrigued people as to how can you be, a spiritual leader and have gone through tragedy and also be a scientist. So what I lacked in, details of Talmud and Aramaic grammar, which I think most people didn't care all that much about, I had some experience, but I absolutely recognize that I think it had a lot to do with the fact that I'm male. I think, I fit people's image of a rabbi. I had a beard in those days. I tried to look like a rabbi, and so I think I fit into that image. So I think I'm on the other side of the coin of sexual discrimination.
By the way, the reason I mentioned Philadelphia is that's where the Reconstructionist Seminary is located.
Yes.
It wasn't just like an arbitrary city.
Oh yeah, right.
Anyway.
Thank you. And that kind of ties into as you express the challenges that you had coming in mid-career. We now have a very interesting transition that's occurring due to the Great Resignation or the Great Retirement, depending upon different perspectives looking at it. As a public school superintendent, we're facing something very similar. Many of us are retiring. Many of us are retiring early, and very few people are interested in joining our ranks. So we're finding it's taking much longer to find a replacement superintendent, let alone one that really suits the community well, because often you're talking about many months, and then maybe not finding exactly the right fit. And that also comes in the question of age and what role that plays. So very similar areas. But I ask you then, as you've looked at it, because I've been asked recently to talk about this from a superintendent perspective, what are the unique challenges in 2022 that are an issue for you presently as a rabbi, and certainly for anybody coming up who has an interest or a desire in being a rabbi?
Well, I can sort of speak to that. First of all, the last 2 years have been very difficult, very challenging. Not only shifting from being live to being virtual, but then back and forth, right? Every time we think we're okay, there's a new variant. And so, I mean, this was probably going to happen anyway, but it just kind of sped up the process of, I think they're calling it multi-level entry ways or something. So, you know, you can either do something live or you can watch it on Zoom or whatever. So all of that was going to happen, but obviously because of the pandemic, it happened much more quickly and people had to adjust much more quickly. There's a lot of mental health issues out there with kids, with adults, because of the 2 years that we spent inside, locked away, you know, not having enough social contact. And then aside from the pandemic, which is a whole big thing in and of itself, you've got an incredibly changing Jewish landscape out there. It's also a changing religious landscape generally. Churches are feeling it as well, but people are not affiliating the way they used to. So the Pew study said that the largest number of people now are people who identify as none, N-O-N-E, like no religion. I'm spiritual, but not religious. And whereas in the past, I think our parents' generation believed that belonging to a synagogue was something you did. You just did it, you know, and your kid had a bar mitzvah if the synagogue actually did bar mitzvahs in those days. That's just what you did. It's like you inoculate your kids, or used to anyway. And, you know, there's just certain things you did. And you also, when you belong to a synagogue, and I think that probably is the case for the people who are on this call, it wasn't about what do I get for it. It's also about sustaining the Jewish community for the future. So even if I don't have kids in religious school, I want there to be a synagogue with a religious school so that we have kids who know about Judaism in the future. That's not the case anymore. And so there's a lot of upheaval going on out there, and places that are closing, places that are merging, people selling buildings, trying to reimagine what we're all about. And I think that is incredibly challenging. And the Union for Reform Judaism has been discussing this for a long time, and they haven't come up with any brilliant ideas because it's really hard. And now my computer's freezing, even though I've added more memory to it.
Yeah,
So
we hear you fine. Your video is a little.
I know. I mean, my husband put in more memory to make this not happen, and I have an Ethernet, but somehow it's still freezing. So I will yield the floor.
I'd like to just add to what I can't help myself, Michael, Rabbi Singer has said, which is that for a long time, there have been very big social changes, societal changes taking place. Even back when I was first ordained in 2006 and I went to Oregon, the Pew studies were showing that there were huge questions about brick and mortar. Do the newer generations really care about brick and mortar? And I think the pandemic has really accelerated those changes, or that evolutionary process where people don't see themselves tied necessarily often or always. Many of us do, obviously, to a particular community or a particular place or a particular building, you know. And now with the changes that have happened with the pandemic, any Erev Shabbat, you can get online and you can go to any synagogue anywhere in the world for Shabbat services. But what happens to community? what happens to connection to other human beings? At the same time, there are changes taking place not only in the Jewish world, religious world, but also, I think, in the business world, where we're evolving from or transforming from a place where people got paid, let's say, a salary, and there was a range of services and expectations, and it was not a quid pro quo per se. We're changing into a fee-for-services society. And you can't be, some people are trying very hard to do it. There are people who are trying all kinds of new ways of structuring their rabbinates and religious communities, but trying to be a fee-for-services rabbi, where, you know, the congregation will pay you X dollars for a service and Y dollars for a life cycle, and then something else for coming in and teaching a class. But where is, again, that bottom line issue, which is what I think, for lack of a better word, religion is all about, is that sacred connection between all of us, with each other, and with whatever it is we understand the divine to be. So these changes, these socioeconomic changes, are filtering down into the religious world, and it's a problem. People don't want to join. Why should I pay dues? Why should I pay so much in dues when I can, you know, pay a rabbi to do X or pay a rabbi to do Y? And what do I really need? Maybe a rabbi, a Vistaprint rabbi is good enough. You know, they're certainly cheaper. So I think that the young people, or other people, young or otherwise, I actually think that fewer and fewer second career rabbis are being ordained by any of the seminaries anymore. I think there was such a challenge with congregations accepting second career rabbis that the seminaries have been more reluctant to actually take on the challenge of ordaining them.
I think AJR kind of jumped in to fill that role, the
Right.
Academy for Jewish Education.
Yeah. But the three mainstream seminary, well, I think RRC is still, and having lived in the Philadelphia area and gotten very close with the Reconstructionist college and a lot of the people that work there, teach there, and some of their students might disagree with you about Philadelphia. Rabbi Singer, RRC, I think, is probably still a little bit more fluid in terms of what they're doing, but certainly HUC and JTS are not ordaining as many second career people. But even with the younger people who are coming in, or people who are shifting careers earlier in their career, they're facing tremendous challenges in terms of what people's expectations about having a rabbi mean, and how you compensate a rabbi, and what does it mean to be part of a community anymore. All of this is a huge challenge for people coming into the rabbinate now. And of course, there's another piece that we haven't talked about, and I apologize for am I talking too much? Which is, you know, we're 2% of the population, and we experience 57% of the hate crimes that take place in the United States alone, much less elsewhere. And the rise of anti-Semitism, right, in our time is disheartening. It's just disheartening. And I think that it takes a very idealistic human being to want to walk into and be a leader in a time like this. I think it's hard. I'm not saying we have a shortage of those people. I'm just saying that you asked Doug, what are some of the challenges that people are facing? I think that's one of them.
And I do think, you know, I am a community rabbi, and it's a very part-time job, but it is a paid job for the local Jewish Federation. Whoop, it sounds like I'm getting interesting feedback. I don't know. Let's see if I can hold this closer. Can I get your husband, Suzanne, to come out and fix my computer?
Well, he didn't do such a great job with mine, but
That's why I'm asking. most rabbis that I know that describe themselves as community rabbis are really in a gig economy, and they're doing weddings and they're doing funerals and they're teaching, online classes and fee for services. You surprise me, Rabbi. Are there congregations that are actually compensating their own rabbi on a, it's $500 for a funeral and
No, I don't
Oh.
think, well, I don't know, but I do know that there are rabbis who are heading up communities where there are no dues, but people make donations.
right.
So, and traditionally, people have made donations. When do they make donations? When there's a wedding, when there's a bar bat mitzvah, when there's this or that. How different is it? Really, how different is it? There in a congregation where there are no dues and you raise all of your funds through donations.
Mhm.
When you look at it, sort of behind the curtain, what's really going on here? But I think it's an issue. And I know of one congregation in this area that was seriously considering looking for a fee for services kind of rabbi.
Doug, I think that's feedback coming through your system.
That's bizarre because I don't.
I'm trying, yeah, it was him because I just muted him. He
Mhm.
said he was having tech issues. I said, join the club.
Mhm.
Who's having tech issues?
Yeah.
Doug.
Yeah.
So
Oh.
what he was I know what he was going to do next because we just chatted about it, and see if people have some questions beyond the questions. I'm leaving now and trying to rejoin, he says. Okay, goodbye. Does anybody have questions that were not answered? I mean, obviously we could talk all day, but we don't want to, let's see, sounds like those temples are being similar to church model of donations. Yeah, in some ways, they're trying different models for dues, whether it's, pay what you can or, percent of your income or whatever it is. And some people are having a lot of success with getting rid of membership dues and some aren't.
One of
It
the
depends.
problems is Jews aren't trained to make donations like that. In my congregation, Camarillo, we shared space and an administrator with the church. And the guy who was the administrator of the church said, yes, they're donations, but people make a pledge and then they contribute weekly. And like 75% of the congregation shows up every Sunday. And he says his experience is if people go on vacation for a couple of weeks, when they come back, they make up for the donations that they missed. So it's interesting that it is donations, but they're treating their donations like dues.
Yeah, but yeah, the pledges are like dues. You have to pledge how much you're going to pay, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And as you said, 75% of their people go to, Doug is telling me, okay. Here I go again, freezing. Ugh.
We hear you fine, Suzanne.
I know. I'm
picture
just
isn't
very
so-
annoyed by this
Yeah,
because that was supposed to fix it. Okay. Anyway, the point is that yes, 75% of people who belong to churches go to services because that's what it means to belong to a church, which is not the same for a synagogue. Right? A synagogue isn't about necessarily going to services. It might be something completely different, like having a Jewish community. And that's the other thing that's affected how many people belong, because it used to be if you were Jewish, you couldn't belong to other places. And now you can be part of the Junior League, the YWCA, et cetera, which is the case with some of our congregants. So and it was, like this morning, I was talking to one of the parents and why his kid didn't come to religious school. Well, he's got so many other commitments. He does theater, he does this, that. I'm thinking to myself, why is it that if you decide to, let's say, be in the theater in your high school or play in the band, you cannot miss rehearsals. You have to show up. But religious school, that's the one we can, ignore. I don't really get that. And we don't have the power to say, sorry, you have to be here 75% of the time or you get kicked out, because what would happen, right? So
I would also add that we three are speaking from a congregational perspective, but there are many rabbis, I don't remember the number, but it's a significant percentage of CCAR members that are non-congregational. So they're educators, they're community rabbis, they're chaplains. So, there are many rabbis who find a career in a non-congregational path.
right. and doing their own thing, as you said before, having an online, I mean, there's several people in this area who have online communities now that they've created. Are there other questions? You can unmute if you'd like, or put it in the chat. Want to make sure we cover. Harvey, did we cover what you were looking for? It was Harvey's idea to do this, so I want to make sure we covered.
I believe we covered most of it for sure. What you were talking about, the gig economy, reminds me of adjunct faculty for colleges. It's like like I've been doing that for 10 years now, and it's the colleges don't want to hire full-time people, so they pay you piecemeal. You might as well be sewing dresses down in downtown LA in a sweatshop.
Yeah.
There used to be a joke that applies to many careers, but for the rabbinate, it's how do you make a small fortune being a rabbi? And the answer is you start with a large fortune.
That's great. That was not quite the same, but when I had a little pool put in my backyard, and they ripped up my whole irrigation system. Apparently there's a joke with pool people. You don't like your irrigation system, put in a pool. Except they didn't tell me that beforehand. Anyway, that's a whole other story. Okay, so Harvey, anything else?
No, I think you've covered it pretty good.
Great.
Mainly I was wondering about, if you had a spiritual experience, and you covered that pretty well. And
I think it's a combination of, maybe having a spiritual awakening, like, you're having a tragedy with your wife or whatever it is. But then, there's a long path to getting to the change, because to be practical, we all had careers, we all had, mortgages or whatever. And so then how do you decide? I mean, and I cannot tell you how many people said to me, just because you love Judaism doesn't mean you have to leave TV. Why don't you make films about television? It's like, no, that's not like the point at all. Or how can you start all over again, right? You figure it out somehow, you get some part-time jobs, you live sparsely or sparingly, and you make it work. You somehow, if you really want to do it and it really matters enough to you, you make it work. And we're privileged enough to be in the position of being able to do that, because we all have probably some cushion, whether it's inheritance or jobs that paid well or whatever. I mean, if you're, somebody who works at McDonald's, with kids, you probably can't as easily just say, I'm gonna, go do something else, but people do it, which is pretty amazing. But I do want to recognize that we have the privilege of what we've had in our lives.
So there's one other privilege. Notwithstanding and in spite of all of the negatives, you guys have asked about the challenges and what makes it hard and all that other stuff. The truth is, I speak for myself here, I wouldn't be doing anything else.
True.
I wouldn't be doing anything else. There is something about this particular role, this job. And I tell people, really, 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 rabbi isn't something I do, it's what I am.
Absolutely.
I love it. People ask me sometimes they'll come up to me and they'll ask me, where are you a rabbi? And my response is everywhere.
Everywhere and all the time.
Absolutely. So,
I
would like, I'm sorry.
One of the saddest things is when people have a goal or a heartfelt goal, and they never attain that goal. I think for me that's the saddest thing. Because you have a schlep job for most of your life, and then you die basically after that. And there are a lot of people that have a goal. They want to be an artist. They want to do this. They want to do that, and they don't do it because of fear more than anything else. Usually, something's holding them back. And making a breakthrough and being able to get to that point where you're able to do that and follow your goal, even if you don't make any money. I think the important thing is following your goal, following your heart.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I agree with Annette. Totally agree with Annette. I wouldn't do anything else either. And I feel very, very lucky that I was able to do this.
And I also want to comment specifically to Harvey. At one of the kolot that I went to, and may have been the one where we were there together, Annette, a darshanit, not a rabbi, a wonderful woman giving a sermon on a Torah portion, And it was the Torah portion that talked about the Jews being in the desert for 40 years, actually 38 years. We actually reached the edge of the promised land in 2 years. And then because of lack of faith, we were stuck wandering for 38 years. And she raised the question, how many of us never get to our promised land for lack of faith, faith in ourselves and faith in God. And because of that faith, we're stuck. And there's even, a brilliant, it's a Hasidic insight into the actual text where the spies that go into the land see how wonderful the land is, but they see the people and they say, the people there are stronger than we are. So the Hebrew for than we are is mimenu. But because there's no vowels in the text, it can be mimenu, stronger than we are, or mimeno, stronger than he is. Sorry for the gender, but it's there. And so the commentary is the people lacked faith in themselves and they lacked faith in God. And although they were at the edge of their promised land, they were stuck and they never entered. And I remember thinking powerfully, that was when we're ordained at HUC, we carry a Torah scroll set to a place in the Torah that's significant to us. And that was the place where my scroll was set, because it was so powerful to me that, I remember thinking, I'm gonna go to start HUC at 50 and I'll be ordained at 55, my God. And somebody commented to me, maybe it was one of you too, commented to me that, you know what, you're gonna be 55 anyway at some point in time. And the question is, where are you when you're there? And now, that seems like an impossibly long time ago, but here I am.
That's so
Rabbi,
nice.
I also want to quickly comment, being a rabbi is a wonderful job from which to be semi-retired. I just want to give hope to my colleagues that, I just have fun these days doing this kind of thing, doing a tremendous amount of teaching, some of which I get paid for, some of which I don't get paid for, but I am just having a ball.
You're that dog with the waggy tail, Michael.
I am a puppy dog.
I will never, that image is forever burned onto my brain.
Oh, good.
Rabbi Singer,
Yes.
you know my background. I
Yes.
grew up in Europe during the Second World War, and you have been my inspiration.
Thank you.
Your teachings, as well as Rabbi Locker's, whose classes I've attended. Rabbi Koch, I just met you today, but I'm sure you're equally inspiring. And I want to thank you all. And I am very sad that you're going to retire. I know why, but I'll miss you.
Thank you, Susie. And
Yeah.
we will continue to have a close relationship even after I retire,
Thank you.
of course. So Michael made some wonderful comments as his closing comments, even though he may not have known it was his closing comments. Annette, do you want to say anything in closing?
Well, I think I said it too, that it hasn't always been easy, but it has been the most rewarding thing I've ever done. Michael mentioned that some rabbis work outside of congregations. I've done both. I've spent several years as a hospice chaplain, bringing a particular Jewish framework and being with people from every walk of life, but and also in the congregations that I've worked in and taught at. And at the end of the day, it's always about the relationships. It's always about being there with each other in whatever moments, whether they're moments of enormous celebration or moments of great grief and sorrow. Just being there with one another in those sacred moments has been an extraordinary privilege. And I'm looking forward as I move on in this process of becoming a semi-retired rabbi, of doing continuing to do all kinds of things, because said it before, I wouldn't be doing anything else. Nice being a rabbi, you can do it forever. You don't ever stop. So yeah, it's just been, there's nothing in life that's easy. might as well be doing something you really love. And it's wonderful.
Great. So, Doug, anything else you want to add?
Well, those were just, we want to thank you for all the fantastic insights. I know many of us have had questions and we're curious about what your different responses would be. Your contributions, all three of you, during these incredibly challenging times, certainly before, but during these challenging times, we have relied upon you and upon our Jewish community to help navigate our way through the difficult days and the uncertainty. And your experiences in life and your experiences within the Jewish world, your teachings and your time with all of us in fostering and maintaining those relationships and encouraging us to do the same thing, especially during those darkest of days, is certainly appreciated. And we thank all of you for your contributions and certainly for answering these many questions that we've had today. So thank you.
Doug, thank you for moderating this. Really appreciate it. And thank you to my good friends and colleagues. And we will talk again soon and you'll come and teach some more. So have a good rest of the Sunday, whatever's left of it. And we'll see you soon. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you all.